when the safety of a marriage becomes a prison and a hostile silence is the only escape. She looked for light in heroes, but found herself in the fire of the man she was meant to hate. Is a single kiss worth the ruin of a whole life? Listen to my story. It begins now. The rain did not fall in London. It exhaled. A fine grey mist clung to the window pane of the townhouse in Grimmauld Place, blurring the sharp edges of the street lamps into amber bruises against the twilight. Inside, the air smelled of stale tea and the faint, persistent scent of wet wool, a scent that had come to define Hermione Granger's existence. She sat at the heavy oak table, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood. Across from her, Ron was eating. The rhythmic scrape of his fork against the porcelain was the only pulse in the room. It was a domestic sound, a sound of safety and history, yet to Hermione, it felt like the slow ticking of a clock in a room with no exit. "Molly wants us over for Sunday roast," Ron said, his voice thick with a mouthful of shepherd's pie. He didn't look up. He didn't see how she flinched at the mention of the burrow. The noise, the stifling warmth, the inevitable questions about when they would finally fill the spare room. "I have a lot of briefings to review, Ron. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement is always busy. I know, Hermione." He finally looked up, offering a crumb-dusted smile that didn't reach his tired eyes. "But it's Mum. You know how she gets. Just take a few hours off. You're always so wound up lately." Wound up. She looked at her hands. Her knuckles were white, her fingers locked together so tightly they ached. She forced them to relax, smoothing the cuff of her jumper, but the tension simply migrated to her chest, a physical weight that made it hard to draw a full breath. "I'll try," she whispered. She looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the man who had stood by her through a war, the man whose loyalty was as steady as the Earth's rotation. But she also saw the man who didn't notice the books she had stopped reading because they were too dense for dinner conversation. She saw the man who never asked what she thought about the new legislation on centaur rights, but instead complained about the cannon's losing streak. The silence between them wasn't the comfortable quiet of two souls in harmony. It was the silence of two people who had run out of things to say that wouldn't cause a fracture. The next morning, the Ministry of Magic felt like a tomb of cold marble and blue fire. Hermione hurried through the atrium, her heels clicking a frantic staccato against the floor. She was late for a joint briefing on the Secrecy Act revisions, a project that required the cooperation of the Administrative Office and the Wizengamot's primary consultants. She burst into the conference room, her hair frizzy from the damp underground air, clutching a stack of parchment to her chest like armor. "Apologies, I was delayed by a..." She stopped. The room was empty, save for one person. Draco Malfoy sat at the far end of the long mahogany table. He wasn't slouching. He never slouched. He sat with a terrifying, predatory stillness, his silver-grey eyes fixed on a single sheet of parchment. The morning light filtered through the enchanted windows to mimic a pale, overcast sky, caught the sharp line of his jaw and the stark platinum of his hair, drawn back with severe precision. He didn't look up, but the atmosphere in the room changed the moment she crossed the threshold. It was as if the atmospheric pressure had dropped, making the air thin and electric. 10 minutes, Granger," he said. His voice was a low, melodic rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. I assume the savior of the wizarding world hasn't forgotten how to read a timepiece. The lift was stuck, Malfoy. Not everyone can simply apparate into their private office, she snapped, moving to the seat furthest from him. Excuses are for those who lack foresight. He finally lifted his gaze. It was like a physical blow. His eyes were cold, yet there was a burning intensity behind them, a sharp, piercing intelligence that stripped away her defenses. Unlike Ron, who looked at her with a comfortable, fading affection, Draco Malfoy looked at her as if he were dissecting a complex spell. He saw everything. The slight tremor in her hand as she set down her files, the faint, dark circles under her eyes, the way she bit her lip when she was uncertain. "Where is Minister Shacklebolt?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Delayed. A minor crisis with the goblins. We are to begin without him." He slid a file across the table. It didn't slide. It glided, stopping exactly 2 inches from her hand. Hermione reached for it, and for a fleeting second, her fingers brushed the edge of his. The contact was microscopic, a mere ghost of a touch, but it felt like the snap of a static spark in the dead of winter. Draco didn't flinch, but she saw his pupils dilate, a sudden eclipse of black over grey. He pulled his hand back instantly, his fingers curling into a fist atop the table. "Section 4, he said, his voice slightly more brittle than before. "The language regarding the memory modification of Muggles is archaic. It lacks nuance." Nuance? Hermione felt the familiar heat of a debate rising in her throat, a sensation she hadn't felt in months. "The law is designed for protection, not elegance, Malfoy." "It is designed for efficiency, and it is failing," he countered, leaning forward. The scent of him reached her. Sandalwood, expensive ink, and the sharp metallic tang of winter air. "You're so focused on the morality of the spell that you've ignored the psychological residue it leaves behind. It's sloppy work, Granger. I expected better from the brightest witch of her age." Her heart hammered against her ribs. It wasn't anger, or at least, it wasn't only anger. It was the thrill of being challenged, of being seen as an intellectual equal, an adversary worth fighting. "If you find the residue sloppy, perhaps you should have spent more time in the library and less time brooding in your manor," she challenged, her eyes flashing. Draco's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile. He didn't do anything so vulgar. But it was an acknowledgement, a spark of recognition. He watched her, his gaze lingering on the way her chest rose and fell with her quickened breathing. The silence stretched. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, filled with the things they couldn't say. The war, the blood on the floor of his drawing room, the years of vitriol, and this new, terrifying magnetic pull that neither of them could name. "I have spent a great deal of time in the library, Granger," he said softly, the barbs leaving his voice. "Solitude provides an excellent environment for reflection." He looked away then, his gaze dropping to the silver signet ring on his finger. He turned it slowly, the metal biting into his skin. There was a hollow look in his eyes for a fraction of a second, a glimpse of the broken man beneath the tailored suit, the boy who had been forced to grow up in the shadow of a monster. Hermione felt a sudden, treacherous pang of empathy. She wanted to reach out, to ask him if he also woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, listening to a silence that felt too much like a grave. But then the door swung open. Kingsley Shacklebolt strode in, his deep voice booming, and the spell was shattered. Draco immediately retreated behind his mask of aristocratic indifference. He was once again the cold, untouchable Malfoy heir. "Ah, Hermione, Draco. Glad to see you've started," Kingsley said, unaware of the tectonic plates that had just shifted in the room. Hermione tried to focus on the minister's words, but her mind was a traitor. She looked at the parchment in front of her, but all she saw was the ghost of Draco's hand near hers. She thought of Ron, waiting at home with a lukewarm dinner and a conversation about Quidditch, and the guilt hit her like a physical weight. She was a wife. She was a hero. She was one half of the golden couple. And yet, as she sat in that cold stone room, she realized with a terrifying clarity that she felt more alive in a 10-minute argument with Draco Malfoy than she had in 3 years of marriage to the man she was supposed to love. The realization tasted like ash. She looked at Draco out of the corner of her eye. He was writing, his quill moving with fluid, elegant strokes. He didn't look at her again for the rest of the meeting. But as she stood up to leave, she noticed a small scrap of parchment left on the table where he had been sitting. She waited until the room was empty before she picked it up. There was no name, only a single sentence written in that sharp, sloping script. "The residue isn't just in the mind, Granger. It's in the soul." Hermione crumpled the paper in her fist, her heart aching with a sudden, violent longing for a life she had never dared to imagine. She walked out of the room, the hollow echo of her own footsteps following her down the long, lonely corridor. The rain in London turned into a persistent, icy drizzle that seemed to seep through the very stones of the ministry. Hermione stood in the elevator, her reflection in the polished brass doors, looking like a ghost of the woman she used to be. Her hair was pulled back into a knot, so tight it made her scalp ache, a physical manifestation of the control she tried to exert over her crumbling internal world. She went home to Grimmauld Place, but the house felt smaller than usual. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, reaching for her. Ron was in the living room, the flickering light of the fireplace casting dancing shapes across his face. He was asleep on the sofa, a half-eaten sandwich on the coffee table and a sports magazine resting on his chest. The scene was the epitome of domestic peace. Yet Hermione felt a scream building in the back of her throat. She walked past him, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, and went straight to the small room she called her study. She pulled the crumpled scrap of parchment from her pocket. "The residue isn't just in the mind, Granger. It's in the soul." The words were a provocation. They were an admission. She smoothed the paper against her desk, her fingertips trembling. Why did he have to be the one to see it? Why did the man who had once stood by and watched her bleed have to be the one to recognize the slow, invisible hemorrhaging of her spirit? She sat in the dark for hours, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. She thought about her marriage. It wasn't that Ron was a bad man. He was a good man, a kind man. But they were like two different languages trying to form a single sentence. He spoke in colors and sounds, in the tangible world of jokes and food and physical presence. She spoke in shadows and echoes, in the abstract world of what if and why. And then there was Malfoy. He spoke her language, but he spoke the dialect of the damaged. The following week, the atmosphere in the ministry briefing room was thick with the scent of old paper, and the sharp, ozone-heavy tang of Malfoy's magic. They were working on the restoration clauses, the part of the law that dealt with undoing the damage of poorly cast memory charms. "It's not enough to simply lift the fog," Draco said, his voice cutting through the silence of the room. He was standing by the window, his back to her. The grey light of the morning silhouetted his lean frame, making him look like a statue carved from salt. If the charm was cast with malice, the mind creates a scar. You can't just erase a scar, Granger. You have to treat the trauma beneath it. "I know that, Malfoy," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. She was sitting at the table, her quill poised over a document. "But the Ministry doesn't have the resources for long-term psychological rehabilitation for every Muggle affected by the war. Then the Ministry is choosing to leave them broken," he said, turning around. His expression was a mask of cold arrogance, but his eyes were burning. "How very noble of you all. And what would you know about being broken?" The words were out before she could stop them. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Draco's jaw tightened, a small muscle leaping in his cheek. He walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. He stopped at the edge of the table, leaning down until his face was only inches from hers. "I know," he whispered, "that when you break something, the pieces never fit back together the same way. There are always gaps, always sharp edges that draw blood when you try to hold on too tight." He was looking at her mouth. It was a brief, flickering glance, but it felt more intimate than any kiss she had ever shared with Ron. Hermione's breath hitched. The tension between them was a physical thing, a cord pulled so taut it was humming. "You're holding on too tight, Granger," he murmured. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her face. For a moment, she thought he was going to touch her. She found herself leaning into the heat of his palm, her heart racing with a terrifying, forbidden hope. But he didn't touch her. His hand dropped to the table, his fingers brushing against a loose thread on her sleeve. "Your cuff is frayed," he said, his voice returning to its usual icy cadence. "It's distracting." He straightened up and walked back to his seat, leaving her gasping for air in the vacuum he left behind. "We'll move to the next section," he said, his tone final. The seesaw of their interactions became the rhythm of her life. One day, they would work in a state of perfect, silent synchronicity, their minds moving like two parts of a well-oiled machine. He would anticipate her arguments, and she would refine his theories. In those moments, there was a warmth between them, a shared intellectual spark that made the rest of the world feel dull and grey. He would bring her a cup of tea without being asked, the porcelain clicking softly against the wood of the table, and she would offer him a rare, genuine smile. But the next day, the cold would return. He would be biting, cruel, and dismissive. He would make snide remarks about her Gryffindor sensibilities and her unwavering faith in the system. He would retreat behind a wall of pure-blood elitism that she couldn't penetrate, leaving her feeling foolish and exposed. It was a constant push and pull, a dance on the edge of a knife. "Why do you do it?" she asked him one evening, after a particularly grueling session. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody streaks of light across the room. Draco stopped packing his briefcase. "Do what?" "This. The constant shifting. 1 minute you're human, The next, you're the same boy who used to sneer at me in the hallways of Hogwarts. Draco leaned back against the table, his eyes hooded. Because, Granger, the human part of me is a liability. It's the part that gets people killed. It's the part that fails. You didn't fail, she said softly, standing up and walking toward him. You survived. At what cost? He snapped, his voice cracking. He looked at her then, and for the first time she saw the sheer, unadulterated guilt that lived behind his eyes. It was a vast, dark ocean, and he was drowning in it. Look at me, Hermione. Look at what I am. I'm a ghost in a suit. I'm a name that people still whisper with fear or disgust. I don't look at you with fear, she said, her voice steady. No, he whispered, stepping closer. He was so close she could see the individual lashes of his eyes, the tiny scar on his upper lip. You look at me with pity, and I don't know which is worse. He reached out then, and this time he didn't stop. His fingers brushed against her jaw, his touch light as a feather, yet it felt like a brand. His skin was cold, but where he touched her, she felt a searing heat. Hermione closed her eyes, her head tilting into his hand. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated trust, a surrender of all her defenses. But then the sound of laughter echoed from the hallway, the boisterous, easy laughter of some auras leaving for the day. Draco flinched, as if he had been burned. He yanked his hand away, his face hardening into a mask of disgust. Go home to your husband, Granger, he spat, the words dripping with venom. Go back to your perfect, golden life and leave me to my shadows. Draco. Don't call me that, he hissed. We are colleagues, nothing more. If you ever forget that again, I will request a different partner for this project. He swept out of the room, his cloak billowing behind him like a funeral shroud. Hermione stood alone in the darkening room, the place where his hand had touched her jaw still tingling. She felt a cold, hollow ache in her chest, a realization that she was losing a war she hadn't even realized she was fighting. She went home to Ron. He was in the kitchen trying to fix a leaky faucet with a muggle wrench he'd bought on a whim. He looked up when she entered, his face smeared with grease, his eyes bright with a simple, uncomplicated joy. Hey, I almost got it, Hermione. Just one more turn. The wrench slipped and water sprayed everywhere, soaking him. He let out a loud, frustrated groan that quickly turned into a laugh. Well, that didn't go as planned. Come here, give me a hand. Hermione looked at him, at his wet hair, his bumbling clumsiness, his easy ability to laugh at himself. She tried to feel the love that was supposed to be there. She tried to find the comfort she had once found in his presence. But all she could think about was the cold, elegant hand of Draco Malfoy, and the way he looked at her as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. She looked at her husband and felt a profound, devastating sense of regret. I'm tired, Ron, she said, her voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. I'm going to bed. Oh, right. Okay, he said, his smile faltering. I'll be up in a bit. She walked up the stairs, each step feeling like a mile. She lay in the dark, listening to the sound of the rain against the roof, and for the first time in her life, she let herself cry for the girl she used to be, and for the woman she was becoming. The internal monologue in her head was a cacophony of doubt. I chose this. I chose the safety. I chose the hero. Why does it feel like I chose a prison? Why is his coldness more intoxicating than Ron's warmth? Why am I dreaming of grey eyes when blue ones are sleeping beside me? She gripped the sheets, her knuckles whitening in the dark. She was Hermione Granger. She was logical, she was principled, and she was utterly, hopelessly lost. The tension in her life was no longer a secret she could keep from herself. It was a living thing, a parasite that fed on her happiness. And as she drifted into a fitful sleep, the image of Draco Malfoy's face, broken, guilty, and beautiful, was the last thing she saw. The seesaw had tilted again, and this time the drop was deeper than she ever imagined. The next morning, she arrived at the ministry earlier than usual. She needed to see him. She needed to fix it, to apologize, to scream. She didn't know which. But his office was empty. There was only a single white rose on her desk, its petals edged with frost. No note, no explanation. She touched the flower, and the frost melted into a single drop of water that looked like a tear. The silence of the room was louder than any argument. It was the silence of a man who was retreating into himself, a man who was afraid of the very light she was trying to offer. Hermione sat down, the scent of the rose filling her senses, and began to work. But the words on the parchment blurred, and all she could hear was the hollow echo of his voice. "Go home to your husband, Granger." She realized then that the betrayal wasn't what he had said. The betrayal was that she no longer wanted to go home. The white rose sat in a crystal vase on Hermione's desk for 3 days, a silent, freezing sentinel. It did not wilt. It was charmed, of course, a Malfoy's specialty, to remain in a state of arrested perfection, neither living nor truly dead. It was a cruel metaphor for her own heart, and every time she looked at it, she felt the bite of a silver needle against her skin. Draco had not appeared in the briefing rooms since that night. He sent memos instead, delivered by impersonal ministry owls. The parchment was always thick, the ink impeccably black, the tone professional to the point of being surgical. He addressed her as Ministerial Liaison Granger. There were no more scraps of parchment, no more shared breaths in the hollow silence of the evening. The repulsion was palpable, even in his absence. He was punishing her, or perhaps himself, for the moment of contact. Hermione threw herself into her work with a frantic, desperate energy. She stayed late, long after the gas lamps in the corridors had dimmed to a ghostly blue. She avoided the burrow. She avoided the celebratory drinks at the leaky cauldron. Most of all, she avoided the bed she shared with Ron. She would wait until she heard his rhythmic, uncomplicated snoring before she would slip under the covers, lying as far to the edge as the mattress would allow, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. It was on the 4th day that the routine broke. The archives of the ministry were located in the lowest levels, a place where the air was thick with the scent of ancient dust and the faint metallic tang of dormant spells. Hermione was searching for a specific precedent regarding the reversal of memory locks when she saw him. He was standing at the end of a long, narrow aisle of towering shelves, his back to her. He was wearing a black coat that seemed to swallow the dim light. He wasn't researching. He was simply standing there, his forehead pressed against the cold spine of a leather-bound tome. The sight of him, so uncharacteristically undone, made her breath catch in her throat. The seesaw swung violently back toward an agonizing warmth. She didn't think. She didn't weigh the consequences. She moved. The click of her heels on the stone floor was loud in the tomb-like silence. Draco didn't move, but his shoulders tensed. "I told you to leave me to my shadows, Granger," he said, his voice muffled by the books. "You don't get to decide that for me, Malfoy," she replied, stopping a few feet behind him. "You don't get to hand me a piece of your soul on a scrap of paper and then vanish behind a wall of frost." He turned then, and the look on his face was one of raw, visceral exhaustion. The sharp planes of his face were accentuated by the shadows, his eyes sunken and dark. "What do you want from me?" he hissed, his voice a jagged edge. "Do you want me to apologize? To tell you that I regret touching you? I do. I regret it because it reminded me that I am still capable of wanting things I have no right to possess." "You have a right to be human, Draco," she said, stepping closer. The air between them began to hum with that familiar, terrifying static. "No," he said, a bitter laugh escaping his throat. "I am a Malfoy. I am the son of a Death Eater. I am a man who spent his youth trying to find a way to let murderers into a school. My humanity is a stain on everyone I come near. Look at you. You're the hero of the age, and here you are, lurking in a basement with a ghost because your perfect life is a lie." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She flinched, her eyes stinging. "It isn't a lie. It's complicated." "It's a graveyard," Draco countered, taking a step toward her. He was looming over her now, his presence overwhelming. "You're suffocating. I can smell it on you. You smell like dust and disappointment. You go home to a man who looks at you but doesn't see you. He sees the girl who solved his homework. He sees the woman who keeps his house. He doesn't see the fire you're trying so hard to extinguish." "Stop it," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Why? Does the truth burn, Granger?" He reached out, his hand gripping the shelf beside her head, pinning her against the books. "You compare him to me, don't you? Every time he speaks, you wish he had my wit. Every time he touches you, you wonder why his hands feel so heavy and mine feel like—" He stopped, his breath hitching. The arrogance vanished, replaced by a sudden, jarring vulnerability. His gaze dropped to her lips, and for a heartbeat, the world stopped spinning. The tension was so thick, it felt like liquid, a magnetic pull that was dragging them both toward a precipice. "Like what, Draco?" she breathed, her own hand rising to hover near his chest. He closed his eyes, his knuckles whitening where he gripped the shelf. "Like a promise I can't keep." He pulled away abruptly, the warmth vanishing as quickly as it had arrived. He straightened his coat, his face hardening into that familiar, impenetrable mask. "The minister expects the draft by tomorrow. I suggest you focus on your duties and not on the delusions of a broken man." He brushed past her, his shoulder jarring against hers, a deliberate, cold friction that left her reeling. Hermione returned to the surface world in a daze. She walked through the atrium, past the golden statues and the bustling crowds, feeling like an alien in her own life. When she arrived home, the house was full of the scent of burnt onions and the sound of the wireless playing a jaunty, wizarding tune. Ron was in the kitchen, humming along, looking remarkably content. "Dinner's almost ready. I tried that recipe your mum sent, the one with the leeks. Think I might have overdone the heat a bit, though." He turned around, grinning, a dish towel slung over his shoulder. He looked so wholesome, so uncomplicated. He was the sun, and Draco was the moon. One provided warmth and light, the other was cold, distant, and dictated the tides of her soul. "Ron," she said, her voice trembling. "Yeah, Hermione?" He walked over, sensing something was wrong. He reached out to tuck a stray hair behind her ear, his hand large and warm. She flinched. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but she saw the flash of hurt in his eyes. I have a headache. I think I'll just lie down." "Again? You've had a lot of those lately." Ron's hand dropped. The grin faded into a look of bewildered concern. "Is it the work? I told you, that Malfoy bloke is probably driving you mad. He's a git, always has been. Why Kingsley put you with him, I'll never know." "He isn't a git, Ron. He's brilliant. And he's doing more for the Secrecy Act than anyone else in that department." Ron's expression shifted. A flicker of something that looked like suspicion, or perhaps just a dawning realization of a distance he couldn't bridge. "Right. Brilliant. Sorry I'm not brilliant enough for you these days, Hermione." "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." He turned back to the stove, his shoulders slumped. The silence that followed was heavy and bitter, a seesaw of guilt and resentment that threatened to tip them both over. Hermione fled to her study. She shut the door and locked it, a non-verbal act of betrayal that felt louder than a shout. She sat at her desk and looked at the white rose. It was still there, perfect and frozen. She reached out and touched a petal. It was cold, so cold it made her fingers ache. "I regret it," she thought. The words were a silent scream in her mind. "I regret choosing the easy path. I regret choosing the person who makes me feel safe instead of the person who makes me feel alive." She pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward her and began to write. Not a report, not a brief. "The residue is everywhere, Draco," she wrote, her quill scratching fiercely against the paper. "It's in the tea I drink, the bed I sleep in, the air I breathe. You think you're the only one who is broken. We all are. Some of us are just better at hiding the cracks with wallpaper and smiles." She stared at the words. They were too honest, too dangerous. She went to throw the paper into the fire, but her hand stopped. Instead, she folded it neatly and tucked it into the pocket of her robes. The next morning, the cold had returned with a vengeance. The briefing room was occupied by other officials, and Draco was nowhere to be found. He had submitted his final notes and requested a transfer to the Paris branch of the International Confederation of Wizards. The news felt like a physical blow to her stomach. She found him in the owlery, a tall, draughty tower filled with the soft ruffling of feathers and the scent of straw. He was tying a letter to a sleek black eagle owl. "Paris?" she said, her voice echoing in the stone chamber. Draco didn't turn around. "It's a logical move. The French ministry is in chaos. They need someone with my particular skill set." "You're running away." "I am moving on," he corrected, finally turning to face her. The wind from the open window whipped his hair across his eyes. "There is nothing for me here, Granger. Only memories of things I can never have and a reputation I can't outrun. There's the work. There's the progress we made." "The work is done," he said, stepping toward her. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "And as for the progress, some things are better left unfinished." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver object. It was a seal, the Malfoy family crest. He held it out to her. "Take it, a souvenir of the git you had to work with." Hermione looked at the seal, then at his hand. She felt the seesaw swinging again. Trust, doubt, warmth, cold. She reached out, but instead of taking the seal, she grabbed his wrist. Her skin met his, and the friction was visceral. He gasped, his eyes flying wide. "Don't go," she whispered. "Hermione," he breathed, her name sounding like a prayer and a curse all at once. For a second, the mask shattered. He looked at her with such longing, such desperate, soul-crushing hunger, that it took her breath away. He started to lean in, his thumb tracing the pulse point at her wrist, his touch no longer cold, but burning. And then he remembered. He saw the gold band on her left hand. The warmth vanished, replaced by an ice so deep it seemed to freeze the very marrow of his bones. He wrenched his arm away, his face twisting into a sneer of pure, unadulterated self-loathing. "Go back to your husband, Granger," he spat, echoing his words from before. But this time they were laced with a different kind of pain. "Go back to the man who doesn't have to hide his hands when he walks down the street. I won't be your other choice. I won't be the shadow you use to cool your skin when the sun gets too bright." He turned and strode toward the exit, his boots echoing like gunshots against the stone. "Draco!" she called out, but he didn't stop. She stood in the owlery, the wind howling around her, clutching the letter she had written the night before. She realized then that the conflict wasn't between her and Ron, or her and Draco. It was between the woman she was supposed to be and the woman she actually was. And as the eagle owl took flight, disappearing into the grey London sky, Hermione Granger felt the first real crack in her foundation. The seesaw had stopped. She was falling, and there was no one to catch her but the very man who had just walked away. The departure of Draco Malfoy for Paris was not a clean break. It was a slow, agonizing amputation. Hermione remained at the ministry, anchored to her desk by the weight of 1,000 half-finished sentences. The silence in the briefing room was no longer a canvas for their intellectual sparring. It was a vacuum that sucked the oxygen from her lungs. Every time the door creaked, her heart performed a treacherous, hopeful leap, only to settle into a dull thud when a generic clerk entered instead of the man with the silver eyes. At home, the atmospheric pressure reached a breaking point. Ron had stopped trying to fix things. The leaky faucet continued to drip, plink, 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 a metronome for her fraying nerves. He sat in the armchair, nursing a bottle of butterbeer, watching her with a mixture of confusion and a growing, silent resentment. They were polite to each other, with the kind of terrifying, fragile politeness that precedes a catastrophe. "You're working late again tomorrow?" Ron asked one evening. He didn't look up from the wireless. "There are some loose ends on the Secrecy Act," Hermione replied, her voice sounding hollow even to her own ears. "Now that Malfoy is gone, the workload has doubled." "Malfoy!" Ron spat the name like a piece of spoiled fruit. "Always Malfoy. You talk about him like he's some sort of martyr. He's a coward, Hermione. He ran away because he couldn't handle the fact that nobody wants him here." Hermione's knuckles whitened as she gripped the back of a chair. The urge to defend him was a physical ache, a fire in her throat. He didn't run away. He was recruited. And people do want him, Ron. He has a mind that... A mind for what? Dark magic? Self-preservation? Ron stood up, the bottle clattering onto the table. "I'm your husband. I'm the one who's here. I'm the one who's always been here. but it feels like I'm living with a ghost. You're in this room, but you're miles away. You're in Paris, aren't you?" "Don't be ridiculous," she whispered, though the guilt tasted like copper in her mouth. "I'm not the brilliant one. I know," Ron said, his voice cracking with a sudden raw vulnerability. "I know I don't read the right books or care about the right laws, but I loved you. I thought that was enough. I loved you. Past tense." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Hermione looked at him, at the freckles on his nose, the familiar warmth of his orange hair, and felt a profound, devastating pity. But pity wasn't love. It was the ash left over after the fire had gone out. "I'm sorry, Ron," she said, her voice barely audible. "Yeah," he sighed, turning away. "Me too." 2 weeks later, an official summons arrived from the International Confederation of Wizards. The French ministry was struggling with the restoration clauses. The translations were failing to capture the magical nuances required for the memory reversals. As the primary author of the English text, Hermione was required in Paris for a 3-day summit. The moment she stepped off the international portkey at the Place de Magie, the air changed. Paris didn't smell of wet wool and stale tea. It smelled of lavender, roasted coffee, and something sharp and electric that she recognized instantly. The summit was held in a sprawling limestone chateau on the outskirts of the city. Hermione moved through the gilded halls, her heels clicking against the marble, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She told herself she was there for the law. She told herself she was a professional. But then she entered the grand ballroom converted into a workspace, and there he was. Draco was standing by a fireplace, speaking rapidly in fluent, melodic French to a group of elderly wizards. He looked different. The shadows beneath his eyes had deepened, but there was a new, hard edge to his posture. He looked like a man who had accepted his exile and turned it into a fortress. He saw her across the room. The conversation died on his lips. The wizards around him looked confused, but Draco's gaze was locked on Hermione, a visceral alignment that seemed to pull the very air from the room. He didn't approach her. He stayed by the fire, the orange glow flickering across his pale features, his expression a mask of cold, professional indifference. But she saw the way his fingers tightened around the stem of his wineglass until the crystal groaned. The first 2 days of the summit were a masterclass in repulsion. Draco treated her with a frigid academic distance that was more painful than his insults had ever been. He addressed her as Madame Weasley, a title that felt like a slap every time it left his lips. He dismantled her arguments with a surgical precision, pointing out Anglo-centric biases in her prose with a sneer that made her blood boil. "The logic holds in London, perhaps," he said during a particularly tense session, his voice echoing in the vaulted room. "But here, the magic is more fluid. You're trying to cage a storm in a birdhouse, Madame Weasley. It's a typical Gryffindor failing, imposing structure where only grace will suffice. And I suppose you're the arbiter of grace now, Malfoy." Hermione snapped, her eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "Exile seems to have inflated your ego along with your vocabulary." The French delegates exchanged nervous glances. The tension between the 2 English consultants was a physical weight, a magnetic pull that threatened to disrupt the very enchantments on the walls. I am simply realistic, Draco replied, his eyes narrowing. Something you have always struggled with. He turned on his heel and walked out, leaving the room in a stunned, vibrating silence. That night, a thunderstorm broke over Paris. Hermione sat in her room at the chateau, the sound of the rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows, a deafening roar. She couldn't sleep. The seesaw was stuck on repulsion, a cold, jagged feeling that made her want to scream. She needed air. She threw a cloak over her nightgown and slipped out into the corridor. The chateau was dark, lit only by the occasional flicker of lightning that turned the tapestries into grotesque moving shapes. She found herself in the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with exotic, magical plants that thrived in the dark. The scent of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine was overwhelming. And there, standing in the center of the room, was Draco. He was coatless, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his hair disheveled. He was staring out at the rain, his reflection in the glass looking like a drowned man. "You're following me, Granger," he said, not turning around. He had dropped the Madame Weasley. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice trembling. "Neither can I. The ghosts here speak French, but they say the same things." He finally turned to face her. In the sudden flash of lightning, his face was a portrait of raw, unadulterated agony. "Why are you here, Hermione? Truly?" "The summit. Liar," he hissed, stepping toward her. The space between them was filled with the scent of ozone and the heavy, humid heat of the conservatory. "You came because you couldn't stand the silence. You came because you wanted to see if I was as miserable as you are." "I am not miserable," she lied, her voice breaking. "You are a catastrophic lie," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He was so close now she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the cool rain outside. "You're wearing a ring that feels like a shackle. You're living a life that's a tribute to a girl who died in the war. And you hate me because I'm the only one who sees it." "I don't hate you," she breathed. "You should." He reached out, his hand hovering near her throat, his fingers trembling. "You should hate me for what I am, and for what I'm about to do." He didn't touch her. Instead, he leaned in until his forehead rested against hers. It was a gesture of such profound, quiet intimacy that it shattered her. Hermione closed her eyes, her breath hitching as she felt the magnetic pull finally win. "I regret it," she whispered into the space between them. "I regret choosing the safety. I regret choosing the person I thought I should be." Draco let out a jagged, broken sound, half laugh, half sob. "And I regret that I'm not a better man. I regret that I can't just take you and forget the world. But I'm a Malfoy. I'm the residue, remember?" He pulled back, his eyes searching hers. For a moment, the warmth was so intense it was blinding. Trust, raw and bleeding, hung between them. "If I stay," he whispered, "I will ruin you. I will turn your perfect golden life into ash. Is that what you want, Hermione? To burn with me?" "It's already ash, Draco," she said, her hand finally rising to rest against his chest, over his racing heart. "I've been burning for a long time. I just didn't realize the fire was you." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of their choices. The tension was no longer a cord. It was a bridge. Draco looked down at her hand on his chest, his knuckles whitening as he fought the urge to cover it with his own. "Go back to your room, Granger," he said, his voice thick with a desperate, failing resolve. "Before I forget that I'm trying to save you." "I don't want to be saved," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "I want to be known." She stepped even closer, the bite of his silver ring pressing against the fabric of her cloak as he finally gripped her arms. The friction was visceral, a tactile explosion of all the months of suppressed longing. He looked like he wanted to devour her and push her away all at once. "You're making a mistake," he groaned, his grip tightening. "Then let it be mine," she challenged. The seesaw tipped one last time that night, not toward cold, but toward a heat so absolute it threatened to consume the very foundations of their lives. Draco stared at her, his grey eyes swirling like a storm-tossed sea, and for the first time, the doubt was gone. There was only the visceral alignment of two souls who had finally found the only other person who spoke their broken language. But as the thunder rolled overhead, Draco let go. He stepped back into the shadows, his face hardening once more. "Not like this," he whispered. "Not while you still belong to him." He walked out of the conservatory, leaving Hermione alone amidst the night-blooming jasmine, her skin cold where his hands had been, her heart finally, irrevocably awake. The middle of the story had reached its peak. The conflict was no longer internal. It was a war between two worlds, and only one could survive the dawn. The dawn that followed the storm in Paris was a pale, sickly thing. Hermione stood by the window of her room, watching the light crawl over the limestone balustrades of the chateau. Her skin felt too tight for her body, every nerve ending vibrating with the ghost of Draco's heat. "Not while you still belong to him." The words were a brand, a reminder of the morality she had worn like a cloak for so long, only to find it had become a shroud. The final day of the summit was a blur of technicalities and legal jargon. Hermione moved through the motions like an automaton. She avoided Draco's gaze, but she felt him. He was a constant, heavy pressure in the room, a gravitational pull that skewed her every thought. When they finally signed the revised restoration clauses, the scratch of the quills sounded like the tearing of silk. It was over. The project was finished. The bridge between them had been built, crossed, and now stood ready to be burned. "Safe travels, Madame Weasley," the French minister said, bowing slightly. Hermione nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She looked at Draco. He was standing by the mahogany doors, his briefcase in hand. He looked at her, just once, a long, searching look that stripped her bare. Then he was gone, disappearing into the crowded hallway without a word. The return to London was a descent into a grey, airless reality. The portkey deposited her in the ministry atrium, and for a moment the bustling noise of the British wizarding world felt like an assault. She walked home to Grimmauld Place, her feet dragging. When she entered the house, it was quiet. Too quiet. There was no wireless playing, no smell of burnt onions. She found Ron in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a piece of parchment in front of him. He looked up as she entered, and the expression on his face made her heart stop. It wasn't anger. It was a cold, hollowed-out clarity. "You're back," he said. His voice was flat, drained of its usual warmth. "The summit finished early," she replied, her hand trembling as she reached to take off her cloak. "Did it?" Ron stood up, sliding the parchment across the table. It was a letter from the International Confederation, a routine notification of the summit's attendees. But beneath it was another scrap of paper. The note Hermione had written and forgotten in her robe pocket weeks ago. The residue is everywhere, Draco. The silence that followed was a visceral impact, a jarring collision of two lives that had finally run out of track. "I went to move your robes to the laundry," Ron said, his eyes fixed on hers. "It fell out. I didn't mean to read it, but I saw his name. Draco. Not Malfoy. Draco." "Ron, I can explain." "Explain what? That you've been burning for him. That our marriage is wallpaper." He let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "I'm not a genius, Hermione. I know I'm not brilliant, but I'm not a fool. I've spent months watching you pull away, watching you look at me like I'm a stranger in my own house. And all the while, you were thinking of him." "It's not what you think," she whispered, though it was exactly what he thought. "Isn't it? Did you touch him? Did you look at him the way you used to look at me?" He stepped closer, his face flushing with a sudden, violent hurt. "The great Hermione Granger, the champion of the underdog. And you chose the one person who represents everything we fought against. Why? Because he's complex? Because he's broken?" "Because he sees me, Ron!" she screamed, the dam finally breaking. The sound echoed through the house, sharp and final. "He sees the parts of me that you don't even know exist. He sees the ambition, the darkness, the exhaustion. You want a hero, Ron. You want the girl from the stories who always has the answers. But I'm tired of having the answers. I'm tired of being the steady one." Ron recoiled as if she had slapped him. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a devastating, quiet defeat. "I didn't want a hero, Hermione. I just wanted my wife." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He didn't pack a bag. He didn't shout anymore. He simply walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice small. "To the burrow," he said, not looking back. "I can't be here. I can't look at you and know that every time I touch you, you're wishing I was him." The door clicked shut behind him. It wasn't a slam. It was a soft, definitive end. The house was cold. Hermione sat on the floor of the kitchen, the scrap of parchment clutched in her hand. The seesaw had finally snapped. The trust was gone, the warmth was extinguished, and she was left with nothing but the truth. She stayed there for hours, watching the shadows move across the floor. She thought about her life, the neat, orderly progression of her achievements, her marriage, her reputation. It was a beautiful structure, but it was built on the wrong foundation. She had chosen Ron because he was the right choice, the safe harbor after the storm of the war. But you cannot live in a harbor forever when your soul belongs to the open sea. The next morning, she went to the ministry. She didn't go to her office. She went straight to the Department of International Cooperation and demanded the address of Draco Malfoy's residence in Paris. "It's restricted information, Mrs. Weasley," the clerk said, looking uncomfortable. "I am the senior ministerial liaison to the Wizengamot," she said, her voice like ice. "And I am not asking as a wife. I am asking as a colleague who has a matter of urgent legislative importance to discuss." 10 minutes later, she held a small slip of parchment with an address in the Le Marais district. She didn't wait. She didn't go home to pack. She took a port key from the ministry basement, the familiar sensation of a hook behind her navel pulling her through the void. She arrived in Paris as the sun was setting, the sky a bruised purple and gold. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and rain. She found the building, a narrow, elegant stone townhouse with a black wrought-iron gate. Her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs as she reached for the bell. What was she doing? She was a married woman, technically. She was a public figure, and she was standing on the doorstep of a man who had told her to leave him. The gate clicked open. Hermione walked up the small stone path and pushed the heavy oak door. It wasn't locked. The interior was dim, lit only by a few flickering candles. It smelled of old books and that sharp metallic scent of Draco's magic. She followed the sound of footsteps to a room at the back of the house. A library, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with dark, leather-bound volumes. Draco was standing at a desk, his back to her. He was wearing a dark silk dressing gown, his hair loose and falling over his forehead. He didn't turn around when she entered. "I told you not to come, Hermione," he said. His voice was low, vibrating with a tense atmospheric pressure. "Ron left," she said. The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like it might crush her. Draco slowly turned around. His face was a mask of restrained emotion, his eyes silver dark in the candlelight. "He found the note," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "He knows. And I realize now, I've known for a long time. I just didn't have the courage to say it." "And what is it you're saying?" Draco asked, stepping out from behind the desk. He moved with a slow, predatory grace, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm saying that I regret it. All of it. The years spent trying to fit into a mold that was too small for me. The years spent pretending that I didn't think of you every time the wind changed." She took a step toward him, her knuckles white as she gripped the strap of her bag. "I'm saying that I don't want to belong to anyone but myself. But I want to be with you." Draco stopped a few feet from her. The repulsion was gone, but the doubt remained, a flickering shadow in the depths of his eyes. "You think it's that easy? You walk out of your life and into mine, and the world just lets us be? I am still the man who has a mark on his arm, Hermione. I am still the person who will always be looked at with suspicion." "Then let them look," she said, her voice a fierce whisper. "I don't care about the world. I care about the silence in that house. I care about the way you look at a law like it's a puzzle to be solved, and the way you notice when my cuff is frayed. I care about the fact that you're the only person who makes me feel like I don't have to be perfect." Draco's face softened, the iron grip he held on his emotions finally beginning to slip. He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them. "You're choosing a hard road, Granger." "I've always preferred the difficult path," she said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. He moved then, a sudden, fluid alignment of motion. He didn't kiss her. Instead, he grabbed her hands, his fingers interlocking with hers. The touch was visceral, a tactile friction that sent a jolt of electricity through her entire body. He pulled her closer until they were breathing the same air. "I've spent every night since I left London trying to hate you," he whispered, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. "I tried to convince myself that you were just a Gryffindor with a savior complex, but I couldn't, because even in my dreams, you were the only thing that made sense." Hermione closed her eyes, the warmth of him washing over her like a tide. For the first time in years, the tension in her chest eased. The seesaw had finally leveled. But then he pulled back, his eyes searching hers with a sudden, sharp intensity. "If we do this," he said, his voice raw, "there is no going back. There is no Ron to catch you if you fall. There is only this. Only the shadows and the work and whatever we can build from the ruins. I don't want to go back, she said. Draco looked at her for a long moment, his gaze lingering on her mouth, then her eyes. He seemed to be memorizing her, as if he still couldn't believe she was real. Then he let go of her hands and turned back to his desk, picking up a silver letter opener and turning it over in his fingers. The French ministry has offered me a permanent position, he said, his voice regaining its cool professional edge. They want me to lead a task force on the psychological effects of the war. They need someone who understands the residue. He looked at her over his shoulder, a challenge in his eyes. They asked if I knew of anyone who could handle the administrative and legal complexities. Someone with unwavering principles and a brilliant mind. Hermione felt a spark of the old fire in her veins. And what did you tell them? I told them I knew someone, he said, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. But she's quite expensive, and she doesn't tolerate fools. The warmth between them was no longer a flicker. It was a steady, growing flame. The conflict of the past months, the can't stand it and the can't help but think, had crystallized into a shared purpose. I should go, she said softly. I need to find a place to stay. I can't stay here. Not yet. Draco nodded, his expression serious. There is a hotel nearby, the Place des Vosges. It's quiet. I'll send my owl with the details. He walked her to the door. As she stepped out into the cool Parisian night, he reached out and caught her sleeve, pulling her back for a fraction of a second. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, his silver eyes burning with a promise that made her knees weak. Then he let her go. Hermione walked down the street, the sound of her own footsteps echoing against the stone. She was alone in a foreign city. Her marriage was over. Her career was in shambles. And yet, as she looked up at the stars reflecting in the Seine, she felt a profound, exhilarating sense of freedom. The residue was still there, but it was no longer a weight. It was the soil from which something new was beginning to grow. She was no longer the girl who had chosen the hero. She was the woman who had chosen herself. And she knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that Draco Malfoy was waiting for her in the shadows, ready to build a new world from the ashes of the old. The transition had begun. The end of the beginning was here. The Hôtel de la Place des Vosges was a sanctuary of velvet and shadows. Hermione spent her first 3 nights there in a state of suspended animation, the silence of the room punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic tolling of church bells. She had sent a single, brief letter to Ginny, not to explain, for how could she explain a landslide, but to say she was safe. She did not write to Ron. The space where his name used to live in her mind was now a cauterized wound, numb and still. On the 4th morning, a ministry owl tapped at her window. It wasn't a summons from London, but a heavy, cream-coloured envelope from the French Ministry of Magic. Inside was an official appointment for a preliminary hearing regarding the Psychological Reparations Task Force. She dressed with trembling fingers. She chose a suit of deep charcoal silk, its lines sharp and unforgiving. She pulled her hair back into a sleek, professional knot, but her eyes, reflected in the gilded mirror, betrayed her. They were wide, haunted, and flickering with a dangerous, expectant light. The French ministry was housed beneath the Palais Royal, a labyrinth of white marble and enchanted sunlight. When she entered the designated briefing room, the atmospheric pressure shifted instantly. Draco was already there. He was standing by a long obsidian table, reviewing a map of the magical ley lines of Europe. He looked as though he hadn't slept either. His skin was the color of parchment, and the silver of his eyes seemed to have bled into the surrounding air. He didn't look up when she entered, but the air in the room began to vibrate with a low-frequency hum, the sound of two powerful magical signatures recognizing each other. "You're late, Granger," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "The streets of Paris are more convoluted than the laws we're trying to rewrite," she replied, moving to the opposite end of the table. For 3 hours, they worked in a state of high tensile friction. The seesaw was no longer about their past. It was about the future. They argued over the ethics of memory weaving and the definition of soul residue. Draco was cynical, his views tempered by a lifetime of witnessing the worst of wizarding nature. Hermione was idealistic but weary, her logic sharpened by the realization that sometimes the only way to heal a wound was to let it scar. "You can't mandate forgiveness, Hermione," Draco snapped, slamming a folder onto the obsidian surface. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "The law can provide compensation, it can provide safety, but it cannot force a man to look at his reflection without flinching. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Draco. I'm asking for a framework that doesn't treat trauma as a bureaucratic inconvenience." She stepped closer, her heels clicking a sharp rhythm. "You speak as if the victims are the only ones with scars. What about the architects? What about the people who carried the wands?" Draco turned to her, his face inches from hers. The scent of sandalwood and cold ink was intoxicating. "The architects don't want a framework. They want to disappear. They want to be forgotten so they can stop remembering." "And is that what you want?" she whispered, the professional distance evaporating. "To be forgotten?" Draco's eyes searched hers, the silver darkening into a stormy grey. His hand rose, his fingers hovering near the pulse point in her neck. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the static of his magic, a magnetic pull that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. "I want," he began, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "to be able to walk into a room and not feel the air turn to ice. I want to look at you without seeing the ghost of the man you left behind." "He was a ghost long before I left him," Hermione said, her voice steady. Draco's thumb finally grazed her jawline. It was a light, feather touch, but it felt like a brand. The warmth was sudden and violent, a visceral alignment that made her breath hitch. "You're playing with fire, Granger," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. "I've spent my whole life being careful," she replied. "I'm tired of being careful." Before he could respond, the heavy doors of the briefing room swung open. A French official entered, babbling apologies for the interruption. Draco pulled his hand back instantly, his face hardening into a mask of aristocratic boredom. The cold returned so quickly it made Hermione shiver. The following weeks were a masterclass in emotional seesaws. They met every day, building a project that would eventually become the most significant piece of post-war legislation in a century. In the light of the ministry, they were the perfect team, efficient, brilliant, and untouchable. They moved in a choreographed dance of intellect, their minds weaving together like a complex tapestry. But in the evenings, the tension became unbearable. Draco would walk her to the edge of the Place des Vosges, the silence between them thick with the things they weren't saying. He never invited her into his home, and he never asked to see hers. He kept a distance that was both respectful and agonizing, a repulsion born of his own deep-seated guilt. "Why won't you let me in?" she asked one night, the rain beginning to fall in fat, lazy drops. They were standing under the eaves of a bookstore, the yellow light from the window illuminating the sharp planes of his face. "Because if I let you in, Hermione, I won't let you out," he said, his voice flat. "And you aren't ready for that. You're still mourning a life you haven't fully buried." "I am not mourning," she cried, her frustration boiling over. "I am trying to live. I am trying to find a way to be the person I am when I'm with you, instead of the person everyone expects me to be." "And who is that person?" Draco challenged, stepping into her space. "The woman who likes the way a Malfoy touches her. The woman who finds solace in the darkness of a library instead of the warmth of a family dinner." "Yes," she shouted. "That woman. She's been screaming to get out for 10 years, and you're the only one who ever heard her." Draco grabbed her shoulders, his grip tight and desperate. He looked like he wanted to shake her and kiss her at the same time. "I am a broken man, Hermione. I am the residue. You think you can heal me with your logic and your light, but all you'll do is burn yourself out." "Then let me burn," she whispered, her hands rising to grip his wrists. He looked at her with a raw, visceral hunger that terrified her and thrilled her in equal measure. For a moment, the trust between them was so absolute, it felt like a physical weight. He leaned in, his lips a hair's breadth from hers, and she could feel the tremor in his hands. But then he pulled away. He let go of her as if she were made of hot lead. "I can't," he choked out. "Not like this. Not while I still see the should in your eyes." He turned and vanished into the rain, leaving her standing alone in the shadows of the books. The betrayal came from across the sea. A week later, the Daily Prophet arrived at the French ministry. The front page was a visceral blow. A grainy photograph of Hermione and Draco standing close together outside the bookstore, their faces illuminated by the yellow light. The headline was a masterpiece of character assassination, the fallen hero, Granger's shameful exile in the arms of a Death Eater. The article was a vitriolic retelling of her difficult marriage to Ron, painting him as the tragic, abandoned husband and her as the cold-hearted traitor who had been seduced by Malfoy's dark influence. It hinted at scandals, at secret meetings during the Secrecy Act briefings, at a betrayal that had begun years ago. Hermione stared at the paper, her stomach churning. The doubt hit her like a physical weight. Had she ruined everything? Had her pursuit of her own truth destroyed the very things she had fought to protect? She looked up to find Draco standing in the doorway of their office. He was holding the same paper, his face a mask of cold, terrifying stillness. "Is this what you wanted?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "To be the subject of public scorn? To have your name dragged through the mud alongside mine?" "Draco, I didn't. You should have stayed in London," he said, his voice cutting through her words like a knife. "You should have stayed with your hero and your safety. I told you I would ruin you." I told you my humanity was a stain. I don't care about the paper, she screamed, standing up so quickly her chair toppled over. I care about us. I care about what we're building. There is no us, Hermione, he said, his eyes turning into shards of ice. There is only a scandal and a mistake. You were right to regret choosing Ron, but you were a fool to choose me. He threw the paper onto her desk and walked out. The repulsion was final. The warmth was gone, replaced by a cold so deep it felt like her very soul was freezing over. She sat in the empty office, the sound of the Parisian traffic a distant roar, and for the first time since leaving Grimold Place, she felt the full, crushing weight of her regret. But it wasn't the regret of leaving Ron. It was the regret of believing that she could ever be more than a ghost to a man who was already dead inside. She stayed in the office until the sun went down, the shadows stretching across the floor like long, grasping fingers. She thought about the seesaw, the constant shifting between hope and despair, trust and betrayal. She realized that she had been waiting for Draco to save her, just as she had waited for Ron to complete her. But no one was coming. She stood up, straightened her suit, and walked out of the ministry. She didn't go to the hotel. She walked through the streets of Paris, her mind a cold, clear diamond. She thought about the residue and the restoration. She thought about the law she had written. If the charm was cast with malice, the mind creates a scar. You can't just erase a scar. You have to treat the trauma beneath it. She stopped at the edge of the Seine, the water dark and swirling beneath the bridges. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver signet ring Draco had given her in the owlery weeks ago. She looked at the Malfoy crest, the symbol of everything that had kept them apart. She didn't throw it in the river. She put it on her finger. The metal was cold, biting into her skin, but it felt right. It felt like a promise. Not a promise to him, but a promise to herself. She would not be defined by the Prophet, or by Ron, or even by Draco's fear. She would be defined by her own choices. Conflict was no longer between her and the world. It was between the woman who was afraid and the woman who was free. She turned away from the river and began to walk toward the Le Marais district. She didn't hurry. She moved with a slow, deliberate purpose. She knew what she had to do. The seesaw had stopped. The weight was equalized. She reached Draco's townhouse and didn't ring the bell. She used her own magic, a sharp, precise pulse that bypassed his wards. Wards she had learned to read like a map during their months of working together. The door swung open. The house was dark, the only light coming from the fireplace in the library. Draco was sitting in a leather chair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, staring into the flames. He didn't look up when she entered. "I told you to leave, Hermione," he said, his voice hollow. "And I told you I don't follow orders," she replied, walking into the center of the room. She stood before him, the silver ring glinting on her hand in the firelight. Draco's gaze dropped to her finger, his eyes widening in shock. "What are you doing?" he whispered. "I am treating the trauma," she said, her voice a low, steady hum. "I am refusing to let the shadows dictate my life, and I am refusing to let you hide behind your guilt because you're afraid of being happy." She stepped closer until her knees brushed against his. "Look at me, Draco. Not at the hero or the scandal. Look at me." He looked up, and for the first time the mask was completely gone. He looked broken, terrified, and utterly, hopelessly in love. "I have nothing to give you but a ruined name," he choked out. "Then we'll build a new one," she said. She reached down and took the glass from his hand, setting it on the floor. Then she pulled him up until he was standing. The tension between them was no longer a cord. It was a bridge that had finally been crossed. The warmth that flooded the room was not the flickering light of the fire, but the visceral alignment of two people who had finally stopped running. "I regret choosing Ron," she whispered, her hands rising to cradle his face. "But I will never regret choosing this. I will never regret choosing you." Draco let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. And finally, after months of silence and shadows, he pulled her into him. The friction was gone. There was only the deep, aching weight of two souls finding their home. But as his lips brushed against her forehead, a cold realization settled in the back of Hermione's mind. The world wouldn't let them go that easily. The prophet was only the beginning. The real war, the war for their right to exist together, was just beginning. The ending was clear, but the path was still covered in shadows. She gripped the back of his shirt, burying her face in his neck, and for the first time in her life, she didn't care about the answers. She only cared about the man who was finally holding her back. The library was a cage of golden light and ancient leather, a sanctuary that felt increasingly like a fortress under siege. Outside, the Parisian night was indifferent, but inside, the air was saturated with the heavy electric scent of a storm that had finally broken. Draco's hands were shaking as they rested on Hermione's waist. It was the first time he had allowed himself to truly hold her, without the barrier of a desk or the shield of a professional disagreement. The tactile friction of her silk suit against his palms was a visceral reminder of everything he had tried to deny himself. He looked down at her, his silver eyes searching hers with a desperate, frantic clarity. "They will never stop, Hermione," he whispered, his voice a jagged shadow of its usual poise. "The prophet, the ministry, your friends, they will hunt you for this. They will turn every accomplishment you've ever had into a footnote of Malfoy's corruption." "Let them," she replied, her voice ringing with a strength that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. She didn't move away. She stepped closer, pressing her palms against the cool silk of his dressing gown, feeling the frantic, uneven thrum of his heart. "I spent my life being the person they needed me to be. I was the brightest witch, the war hero, the perfect wife. I was a statue they built to represent their own victory. But I am not a symbol, Draco. I am a woman, and I am tired of living in a museum." The warmth between them was no longer a tentative spark. It was a conflagration. The years of suppressed longing, the months of intellectual sparring, and the weeks of agonizing silence all culminated in this single, concentrated moment of proximity. Draco's grip tightened, his knuckles whitening. "I am not a good man. I am a man who has learned to mimic goodness because it was the only way to survive. But with you, the mimicry stops, and that scares me more than the Dementors ever did." "Good," she breathed, her gaze locked on his. "Fear means you're awake. It means you're finally feeling the residue instead of just cataloguing it." She reached up, her fingers grazing the sharp line of his jaw. The touch was like a spark to dry tinder. Draco let out a low, guttural sound and buried his face in the crook of her neck. He breathed her in, scents of parchment, rain, and a faint, sweet hint of vanilla that was uniquely her. "I regret every day I didn't look at you," he murmured against her skin. "I regret every time I saw you in the ministry and forced myself to see Weasley's wife instead of the woman who was outgrowing the world." The seesaw of their relationship, the constant, exhausting shift between approach and repulsion, seemed to find its level. But as always with Draco, the trust was immediately shadowed by a flare of doubt. He pulled back slightly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the silver ring on her finger. "You're wearing it," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Do you know what that means? It's not just a souvenir, Hermione. It's a claim. It's a tether to a history you should be running from." "I know exactly what it is," she said, her voice unshakable. "It's a reminder that we are defined by what we choose to keep, not what we are told to cast away. I'm not wearing it for the Malfoys. I'm wearing it for the man who gave it to me because he thought he was protecting me by pushing me away." The tension in the room shifted from the intellectual to the visceral. Silence was no longer a void. It was a magnetic field, pulling them toward a definitive change. Draco looked at her mouth, his breath hitching. The internal monologue that had governed his life for years, the one that told him he was unworthy, that he was a stain, that he was a ghost, fell silent. He leaned in, his lips a hair's breadth from hers. The scent of sandalwood and ozone was overwhelming. "I can't offer you a happy ending, Hermione," he whispered. "I can only offer you the truth. And the truth is that I am broken in ways that even you can't fix." "I don't want to fix," she replied, her hand moving to the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in the soft platinum hair. "I want a partner. I want the man who understands that the scars are what make the restoration meaningful." And then, finally, the seesaw tipped into a warmth that was absolute. Draco closed the distance. It wasn't a soft kiss. It was a collision. It was the frantic, desperate alignment of two people who had been starving for a lifetime. It tasted of salt, of fire, and of a decade of unspoken words. Hermione's world narrowed to the feel of his lips against hers, the scratch of his light stubble, and the way his hands moved to cradle her head, as if she were the most precious, fragile thing he had ever held. The friction was visceral, a tactile explosion that made the air in the library shimmer with their combined magic. In that moment, the Daily Prophet didn't exist. Ron didn't exist. The weight of their reputations vanished, leaving only the raw, pulsating reality of their connection. But even as the heat consumed them, the world outside intervened. A loud, insistent crack echoed through the house, followed by the heavy thud of the front door being forced open. Draco pulled away instantly, his wand appearing in his hand with a fluidity that was born of years of looking over his shoulder. He stepped in front of Hermione, his body a shield of dark silk and lethal intent. "Stay behind me," he hissed, his voice cold and sharp as a razor. "Draco, wait! Malfoy, I know you're in there." The voice was familiar, laced with a raw, agonizing fury. Hermione's blood ran cold. Harry! The library doors burst open. Harry Potter stood in the threshold, his face flushed, his glasses slightly askew. He looked like he had flown across the channel without a broom, his aura robes dusty and windswept. Behind him, Ron hovered, his expression a mask of devastation and simmering rage. The repulsion hit Hermione like a physical blow. The warmth of the moment was gone, replaced by a cold, jarring reality. She stepped out from behind Draco, her chin tilted up, though her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Harry! Ron!" she said, her voice sounding far away. "Hermione, what the hell are you doing?" Harry asked, his gaze darting between her and Draco, his eyes landing on the silver ring on her finger. He looked as if he had been punched in the gut. "The prophet. We thought it was a lie. We thought he'd used some kind of charm on you." "There is no charm, Harry," she said, her voice steadying. "I am here because I chose to be." Ron stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the ring. "With him? After everything? After the war? After the years we spent? You're choosing him?" "I'm not choosing a side, Ron," Hermione said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm choosing a life that isn't built on expectations." "You're choosing a Death Eater," Ron spat, the word dripping with a poison that made Draco flinch, though his expression remained a mask of icy indifference. "You're throwing away everything we were for a man who would have watched you die in his own drawing room." "Enough!" Draco's voice was a low growl, the air in the room beginning to crackle with his magic. "You know nothing of what happened in that room, Weasley, and you know even less of the woman standing in front of you." "I know she's my wife," Ron shouted, his hand moving toward his wand. "She was never yours," Draco countered, taking a step forward, his eyes burning with a silver fire. "She was a trophy you didn't know how to polish. You wanted a companion for your mediocrity, but she was always meant for something more." The tension in the room was a physical weight, a cord pulled so taut it was humming with the threat of violence. The conflict had reached its ultimate peak, not just between Hermione and her past, but between the two worlds that had been vying for her soul. "Hermione, come home," Harry said, his voice pleading now. "We can fix this. We can talk to the minister. We can handle the press. Just leave this place. Leave him." Hermione looked at Harry, the brother she had bled for, the friend who had been her anchor. Then she looked at Ron, the man she had tried so hard to love, whose heart she had just broken into 1,000 pieces. And finally, she looked at Draco. He didn't plead. He didn't ask her to stay. He stood there, a morally grey man with his wand held low, his expression a portrait of silent, agonizing guilt. He looked as if he expected her to go. He looked as if he believed he deserved to be left in the shadows. The seesaw tipped one last time. "I am home, Harry," she said, her voice clear and resonant in the heavy silence. She reached back and took Draco's hand. The touch was a definitive act of betrayal to her past and a definitive act of trust in her future. She felt Draco's fingers tighten around hers, a sudden, desperate grip that told her more than any words ever could. Ron let out a sound that was half sob, half growl. He looked like he was about to curse them both, his face contorted with a grief that made Hermione's soul ache. But Harry put a hand on his shoulder, his own face a mask of grim, silent realization. "Then you've made your choice," Harry said, his voice hollow. "But don't expect the world to forgive you, Hermione, because we won't." They turned and walked out, their footsteps echoing through the house like a funeral march. The front door clicked shut, and the silence that followed was so profound it felt like the end of the world. Hermione stood in the center of the library, still holding Draco's hand. She felt a wave of nausea, a sudden, crushing weight of everything she had just lost. Her friends, her reputation, her history, all of it gone in a single sentence. She felt Draco move. He let go of her hand and stepped back, his face a mask of self-loathing. "They're right," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You should have gone with them." "Don't," she said, her voice sharp. "I have ruined you," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. He began to pace the room, his movements frantic and jagged. "I have taken the brightest light in our world and dragged it into the mud with me. I am exactly what they say I am. I am a plague, Hermione." The repulsion returned, but this time it was coming from him, directed at himself. It was the rot in the foundation he had always feared, the internal guilt that made him push away the only thing he had ever truly wanted. Hermione watched him, her heart breaking for the man who couldn't see the restoration for the scars. She didn't argue. She didn't use logic. She walked over to him and grabbed his arms, forcing him to stop. "Look at me, Draco Malfoy," she commanded, her eyes blazing. "You didn't ruin me. You freed me. You were the only one brave enough to tell me that the life I was living was a lie. And if the world wants to hate me for choosing the truth, then let them. I'd rather be hated for who I am than loved for who I'm not." She pulled him toward her, her forehead resting against his. "The war is over, Draco. The one outside and the one in here." She touched his chest, over his heart. "Stop fighting for a version of yourself that died 10 years ago." Draco's breath came in ragged gasps. He looked at her, his silver eyes swimming with a mixture of terror and hope. Slowly, painfully, the mask began to dissolve. The cold that had governed his life for so long began to melt under the intensity of her warmth. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "We'll learn," she replied. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a soft, tentative promise. This time, there was no collision. There was only a quiet, visceral alignment. The seesaw had finally come to a rest. But as the shadows deepened in the library, Hermione knew that the peace was temporary. The world would not let them be. The Prophet would continue its campaign. The Ministry would likely revoke her credentials, and they would be pariahs in 2 countries. She looked at the silver ring on her finger, the light of the fire catching the sharp edges of the crest. It was a heavy weight, but it was hers. "What now?" Draco asked, his voice steadying as he pulled her back into his arms, his chin resting on the top of her head. "Now," Hermione said, her voice filled with a new, dangerous kind of resolve. "We rewrite the law, not just for the victims, but for us. We show them that the residue isn't a stain. It's the map of where we've been." She pulled back to look at him, a small, fierce smile on her lips. "And then, Draco, we finally go to dinner. Somewhere very public. Somewhere with a lot of light." Draco let out a short, surprised laugh, the first real sound of joy she had heard from him. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, the broken man was gone. There was only the man who had been seen, and the woman who had finally chosen to see herself. The transition was complete. The end was no longer a threat. It was a beginning. The public square outside the Le Grand Véfour was bathed in a golden, artificial twilight, the enchanted lamps of Paris casting long, elegant shadows across the cobblestones. The air was crisp, smelling of rain-washed stone and the rich, buttery scent of haute cuisine. Hermione stood at the edge of the square, her hand tucked firmly into the crook of Draco's arm. She could feel the tremor in his muscles, not of fear, but of a high tensile restraint. He was dressed in a suit of black dragon hide silk that seemed to absorb the light around him, his hair silver bright under the lamps. He looked every bit the Malfoy heir, but his eyes, when they turned to her, were soft, stripped of the jagged ice that had once defined them. "This is the point of no return, Hermione," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against the evening air. "Once we step through those doors, the residue becomes public record. There will be no retreating into the shadows of the Ministry." "I am done with shadows, Draco," she replied, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself. She looked down at her hand, where the silver signet ring sat beside a new, simple band of white gold they had chosen together in a small shop behind the Palais Royal. "I spent 10 years trying to be a beacon for everyone else. It's time I let myself be seen for who I actually am." They moved together, their footsteps a synchronized staccato against the stone. As they entered the restaurant, the hum of conversation died a sudden, visceral death. The elite of the French and British magical communities were gathered there. Diplomats, socialites, and several reporters who had been tipped off by the very scandal they sought to exploit. The repulsion was immediate and palpable. Hermione felt the weight of 100 judgmental gazes, the sharp intake of breath as people recognized the war heroine on the arm of the Death Eater. But she didn't flinch. She didn't tighten her grip. She walked with a slow, deliberate grace, her chin tilted up, her gaze fixed on the table Draco had reserved in the very center of the room. "Madame Weasley," a reporter from Le Cri de la Magie began, thrusting a quick quotes quill toward her. "It's Granger," Draco interrupted, his voice like the snap of a whip. He didn't stop walking, but he cast a look at the man that made the reporter recoil. "And she is here as my guest and my colleague. I suggest you find a more interesting subject for your gossip, or I shall have to discuss the ethics of your accreditation with the minister." The warmth that flooded Hermione's chest at his defense was a steady, grounding force. They reached their table, and Draco pulled out her chair with a focused, non-verbal intimacy that spoke volumes to the watching crowd. It was a gesture of respect, of devotion, and of defiance. The dinner was a masterclass in slow-burn tension. Every time their fingers brushed over the silver cutlery, every time their eyes met over the rim of a crystal glass, the atmosphere between them grew more concentrated. They didn't speak of the scandal. They spoke of the new legislation, of the ways they would dismantle the prejudices of the past, and of the house they had seen in the countryside near Bordeaux, a place with enough library space for 3 lifetimes. "You're not eating," Draco noted, his gaze lingering on her mouth. "I'm full of a different kind of hunger," she whispered, the honesty of the words making his pupils dilate. The seesaw was gone. There was no more approach and repulsion, no more doubt and trust. There was only this, a visceral alignment that made the rest of the world feel like a fading dream. As they left the restaurant hours later, the crowd had thinned, but the air remained electric. They walked toward the Seine, the water reflecting the city lights in a shimmering tapestry of gold and black. The silence between them was no longer a void. It was a sanctuary. They stopped on the Pont des Arts. The wind caught Hermione's hair, swirling it around her face. Draco reached out, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek, his touch no longer cold, but searingly, achingly warm. "I used to think that regret was a poison," he said, his voice barely audible over the rush of the river. "That it would eventually consume everything I was. But you turned it into a forge. You made me realize that the things we regret are the very things that prove we are still capable of being better. We are not the mistakes we made in the dark, Draco," she said, leaning into his hand. "We are the choices we make when the light finally finds us." He looked at her with such raw, unadulterated adoration that it took her breath away. The morally grey man, the emotionally broken heir, had finally found his restoration. And she, the principled hero, had finally found her peace. "I love you, Hermione," he whispered. The words were a definitive shift, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. Hermione felt a tear escape, hot and bright, as she reached up to pull him down to her. "And I love you. For every scar, for every doubt, and for every shadow we've survived." The kiss was the end of the story and the beginning of their life. It was a slow, deep, and devastatingly emotional union that tasted of freedom and of 1,000 tomorrows. It was the warmth that would never fade, the trust that could no longer be broken. When they finally broke apart, the world seemed quieter, as if the magic of the city itself had paused to witness their survival. Draco rested his forehead against hers, his breath hitching. "What now?" he asked, mirroring his question from the library. "Now," Hermione said, her hand interlocking with his, the silver ring catching the moonlight. "We go home, to our home, and we start the work of being happy." They walked away from the bridge, disappearing into the heart of Paris. The residue of their pasts followed them, but it was no longer a burden. It was the soil from which their future would grow. The girl who had chosen the safe path was gone, and in her place was a woman who had fought for the right to be known. The story ended as all true magic does, not with a spell, but with a choice. And for Hermione Granger and Draco Malfoy, that choice was, and always would be, each other. Epilogue. 6 months later. The morning sun in Bordeaux was a soft, pale gold, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air of the Grand Library. Hermione sat at a desk of dark walnut, her quill moving with a fluid, confident rhythm. Beside her, a stack of letters from London sat unopened. Requests for interviews, invitations to galas, pleas for her to return to the fold. She ignored them all. A shadow fell across the parchment. She didn't need to look up to know it was him. She could feel the atmospheric pressure shift, the air turning sweet and electric. "The French ministry has approved the first draft of the reparations bill," Draco said, setting a cup of tea on the desk. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "They're calling it the Granger-Malfoy Accord." Hermione smiled, leaning back into the heat of his chest. "It has a certain ring to it." "It has the sound of a new world," he replied, his hand resting on her shoulder, his thumb tracing the white gold band on her finger. They looked out the window at the rolling vineyards, at the life they had built from the ruins of their reputations. There was no more regret, no more silence, and no more shadows. There was only the light, the work, and the visceral, unshakable truth of their love. The seesaw had finally come to rest, And for the first time in her life, Hermione Granger had everything she had ever dreamed of. Not the person she was supposed to see, but the person she was meant to be. The sun in Bordeaux did not just shine. It bathed the earth in a thick, honeyed light that seemed to heal everything it touched. In the rolling hills of the French countryside, far from the cold marble of the Ministry and the grey ghosts of London, the air felt different. It was heavy with the scent of lavender, wild rosemary, and the rich, humid breath of the vineyards. Hermione stood on the terrace of their villa, a house of pale stone and blue shutters that felt more like a home than anything she had ever known. She held a cup of tea, the ceramic warm against her palms, and watched the golden hour crawl across the valley. For the first time in years, the tension in her shoulders was gone. The internal monologue that used to scream about duty and expectations had finally softened into a peaceful silence. The transition from pariahs to pioneers had been a long, jagged road. The first few months after their public debut in Paris had been a storm of fire and ink. The Daily Prophet had burned through every adjective in the dictionary to describe her betrayal. Ron's family had remained silent, a wall of absence that had hurt more than any shout. But as the dust settled, something strange happened. The world didn't end. The Ministry didn't collapse because Hermione Granger had chosen a Malfoy. Instead, the scandal had forced the wizarding world to look at its own scars. A soft sound behind her made her smile before she even turned. It was the rhythmic, elegant click of heels on stone, followed by the familiar electric hum of his presence. Draco stepped out onto the terrace. He had discarded the stiff, high-collared robes of his former life. He wore a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were no longer tense with a fighter's instinct. He looked younger. The sharp, predatory edges of his face had been blunted by peace. He didn't speak. He never needed to anymore. He simply came to stand behind her, his chest a solid, warm weight against her back. He wrapped his arms around her waist, his chin resting on the crown of her head. "The owls finally stopped coming," he murmured, his voice a low, soothing vibration. "Did they?" Hermione leaned back into him, closing her eyes. "The last one was from Kingsley. He wants to know if we're ready to publish the final volume of the Restoration Statutes. He says the British Ministry is finally ready to adopt the Bordeaux Amendments." Hermione let out a small, ironic huff of laughter. "They're ready because they've realized that the residue is everywhere. They can't hide it anymore." "No," Draco whispered, his lips brushing her temple. "They're ready because they see that the brightest witch of her age didn't lose her mind. She found her soul, and that terrifies them more than any Dark Lord." He turned her in his arms, his hands rising to cradle her face. The friction of his palms against her skin was a visceral anchor. He looked at her with an intensity that still made her breath hitch, a gaze of raw, unadulterated devotion. "Do you regret it, Hermione?" he asked. It was a question he asked once a year, on the anniversary of their first night in Paris. It wasn't asked with doubt, but as a ritual of shared truth. "I regret the time we lost," she replied, her fingers tangling in the platinum hair at his nape. "I regret the years I spent being afraid of the shadows. No, I will never regret the fire that burned the lies away. The seesaw of their past, the push and pull, the trust and betrayal, had settled into a perfect, quiet equilibrium. They were no longer the hero and the villain. They were simply two people who had survived a war and chosen each other as their prize. Draco leaned in, his lips hovering inches from hers. "I bought the neighboring plot of land today," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The one with the old chapel ruins." "For what?" "For a library that belongs to no ministry and no family name. Just books, Hermione. Thousands of them. All the ones we weren't allowed to read, and all the ones we haven't written yet." Hermione felt a wave of warmth so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This was the man Ron could never be. Not because Ron was bad, but because Ron lived in a world of simple truths, and Draco lived in the complex, beautiful reality of her mind. "You're a dreamer, Draco Malfoy," she whispered. "I had an excellent teacher," he replied. And then they kissed. It was a kiss that tasted of aged wine and summer air. It was deep, slow, and filled with a non-verbal intimacy that had been forged in the fires of 100 battles. There was no desperation anymore, only a profound, unshakable belonging. His hands moved down her back, drawing her closer until there was no space left between them, a visceral alignment of two souls that had finally found their center. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of violet and rose, they stayed on the terrace. The silence between them was no longer a prison. It was a conversation. They thought of the world they had left behind, the hollow echoes of Grimmauld Place, the stifling heat of the Borough, the cold marble of London. It felt like a lifetime ago, a different story about different people. "I saw a white rose in the garden today," Hermione said, her head resting on his shoulder. "It wasn't frozen this time. It was just blooming." Draco smiled, his fingers tracing the white gold band on her hand. "The residue is gone, Hermione. We've been restored." "No," she corrected softly, looking at the silver signet ring she still wore on her other hand. "We weren't restored to who we were. We were built into something better." The light faded, and the first stars began to pierce the velvet canopy of the French sky. In the quiet of the night, the only sound was the wind through the vines and the steady, synchronized beating of two hearts. The story that had begun with a spark of hatred in a school corridor and grew through the ashes of a marriage had finally reached its true end. It wasn't an ending of happily ever after in the way the storybooks told it. It was better. It was an ending of truth, of freedom, and of a love that was brave enough to be broken. Hermione looked up at the man who had been her enemy, her rival, and finally, her savior. She saw the lines at the corners of his eyes, the strength in his jaw, and the peace in his soul. She had chosen the hard path. She had walked through the fire and lost everything the world told her she needed. And as she felt Draco's arms tighten around her, pulling her into the warmth of their home, she knew she had never been richer. The seesaw had stopped. The weight was equalized. The restoration was complete. "Come inside," Draco whispered, his voice full of a gentle, playful heat. "The night is young, and I have a dozen arguments about 12th century potion brewing that I've been saving just for you." Hermione laughed, a bright, clear sound that echoed into the valley. She took his hand, their fingers interlocking in a grip that would never let go. "Only a dozen, Malfoy. You're getting soft." They walked through the blue shutters and into the golden light of the villa, the door clicking shut behind them. Outside, The world continued its frantic, noisy spinning, but inside there was only the quiet, eternal magic of two people who had finally found their way home.
Thank you for listening. This story was about two broken people. Hermione was perfect but lonely. Draco was cold but lost. Sometimes we choose the safe path because of what others expect, but real love is someone who sees your scars and stays. It is never too late to be honest. It is never too late to choose yourself. I hope you felt the rain in Paris and the heat of their kiss. Remember, your past does not define you, you choose today do. See you in the next story. Stay magical.